The morning mist clings to the Montana Valley like a secret unwilling to be spoken. Marcus Webb stands alone on the ridge where his great-grandmother Eleanor once stood, his breath forming small clouds in the cold April air. Below him, the family homestead sleeps in blue shadow, unchanged in 62 years. Above him, cutting slow circles through the brightening sky, an eagle rides the thermals with wings spanning nearly 7 feet. Marcus has watched this bird for 3 springs now, but this morning feels different. This morning, the eagle descends. She drops lower with each pass, her shadow sweeping across the frost-white grass until she banks hard and lands on the weathered fence post that Eleanor Webb nailed into this hillside in 1962. The same post, the same position. The wood has been replaced twice, but the eagles keep coming back to this exact spot as if the location itself has been branded into their genetic memory. Marcus doesn't move. He barely breathes. The eagle turns her white-crowned head and fixes him with an amber stare so direct, so knowing, that the hair rises on the back of his neck. In his chest, his heart pounds with something that feels less like fear and more like recognition. She is the 6th generation of her bloodline to return here. 6 generations of eagles flying 2,000 miles each spring, passing countless other ridges and valleys and homesteads, to land on this fence post and watch this family. Science says this shouldn't happen. Territorial imprinting doesn't work this way. Eagles don't form multi-generational bonds with specific humans across 60 years. But here she is, watching him with eyes that seem to hold memories she couldn't possibly possess. Marcus has the DNA evidence in his office. He has the migration data, the genetic markers, the tracking coordinates that prove what his family has always known. But data cannot explain the way this eagle looks at him. Data cannot account for the tremor in his hands or the tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. Because somewhere in the space between science and faith, between what can be measured and what can only be felt, Marcus Webb knows that this bird remembers his great-grandmother. He whispers her name into the cold morning air, Eleanor, and the eagle shifts on her perch, settles deeper into her position, and does not fly away. The year was 1962, and the bald eagles of America were dying. DDT had poisoned the food chain so thoroughly that eagle eggshells had become thin as paper, cracking under the weight of their own mothers. Across the nation, a bird that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands had dwindled to fewer than 500 breeding pairs. In Montana, entire valleys that had hosted eagle families for centuries fell silent. The great birds simply stopped appearing, and those who remembered their presence began to speak of them in the past tense, as if they had already joined the ghosts of the passenger pigeon, the Carolina parakeet. Eleanor Webb knew nothing of DDT or thinning eggshells. She knew only that the eagles had vanished from her valley, and that their absence left the sky feeling emptier than it had any right to feel. She was 67 years old that autumn, a widow for 3 years since Harold's heart had given out in the barn, a woman who had grown accustomed to silence and solitude in equal measure. Her children had scattered to cities, her grandchildren were strangers she saw at holidays, and the homestead that had once rung with voices and laughter now held only the sound of her own footsteps and the ticking of the clock Harold's father had brought from Pennsylvania. She walked the property each morning because walking was what kept her tethered to the living world. The creek trail, the north pasture, the ridge where she and Harold had once watched thunderstorms roll in from the mountains. These walks had become her ritual, her prayer, her daily conversation with a land that had known her since childhood. On the morning of October 14th, the frost lay heavy on the meadow grass, and Eleanor's breath preceded her in small white bursts as she followed the creek toward the cottonwoods. She heard the sound before she saw anything, a strange, weak scrabbling in the dry leaves near the water's edge. Her first thought was a wounded deer. Her second thought was a fox caught in an old trap. What she found was neither. The eagle lay on her side in a drift of golden leaves, her wings half spread, her breast heaving with labored breaths. She was enormous, larger than any bird Eleanor had ever seen up close, with feathers the color of dark chocolate and a head just beginning to show the white that would come with full maturity. Her talons, each curved talon as long as Eleanor's finger, clenched and unclenched against nothing. Her amber eyes rolled toward Eleanor with an expression that might have been fear, might have been exhaustion, might have been the dull acceptance of a creature that knew death was near. Eleanor stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, her hand pressed to her chest. In 67 years of living on this land, she had never been this close to an eagle. They had always been distant presences, silhouettes against the clouds, shapes perched on high branches at the edge of visibility. This bird was anything but distant. Eleanor could see the individual barbs of her feathers, the subtle gradations of brown and gold, the sharp curve of her beak, the terrible weakness in her movements. Something was wrong beyond injury. There was no blood, no obvious wound, no sign of a trap or a gunshot. The eagle simply lay there, trembling, as if her own body had betrayed her. Later, Eleanor would learn that this was how DDT poisoning looked in its final stages: a slow systemic failure, a body too full of toxins to function. In that moment, she knew only that this magnificent creature was dying, and that she could not bear to walk away. She should have called the game warden. She knew that. Bald eagles were protected by federal law, and interfering with one, even a dying one, could mean fines, legal trouble, the kind of attention that a widow living alone did not need. But as she stood there in the cold morning light, watching the eagle's labored breathing, Eleanor Webb made a decision that would change her family's story forever. She removed her coat. It was Harold's old hunting jacket, too big for her, warm with decades of wear and memory. She approached the eagle slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice, the same voice she had once used to calm frightened horses and feverish children. The eagle watched her come. Her beak opened, perhaps in threat, perhaps in exhaustion, but she did not strike. Eleanor knelt beside her in the frozen leaves, feeling the cold seep through her dress, and carefully, so carefully, she spread the jacket over the eagle's body. The bird went still. Whether from warmth or shock or simple resignation, something in her stopped fighting. Eleanor slid her hands beneath the heavy body, felt the racing heart through the layers of feathers, and lifted. The eagle weighed perhaps 12 pounds. Nothing, really, for a woman who had spent her life hauling firewood and feed sacks and reluctant livestock. But the weight felt immense. This was a wild thing, a killing thing, a creature of the high air and the empty sky, and Eleanor was carrying her like a sick child. She walked back to the farmhouse with the eagle cradled against her chest, the amber eyes fixed on her face the entire way. The barn had not housed animals in several years, not since Eleanor had sold the last of the cattle after Harold's death. Now it held only hay bales and old equipment, and the accumulated silence of abandonment. Eleanor cleared a space in the corner that caught the morning sun, and laid the eagle down on a bed of fresh straw. She retrieved a heat lamp from the storage shed, the same lamp they had once used for orphaned lambs, and positioned it to cast warmth without coming too close. The eagle lay where Eleanor placed her, watching, always watching, as if memorizing every movement. That first night, Eleanor did not sleep. She sat in the barn on an overturned bucket, wrapped in blankets against the cold, and kept vigil over a creature she had no idea how to save. She talked to the eagle because silence felt wrong. She told her about Harold, about the children who had grown and gone, about the way the valley had looked 50 years ago when the eagle still filled the sky. She told her about the loneliness that had settled into her bones like winter frost. The eagle listened, or seemed to listen, her amber eyes reflecting the glow of the heat lamp. By morning, she was still breathing. Eleanor took that as a sign. The game warden arrived on the third day. Someone in town had seen Eleanor buying fish at the market, unusual for a woman who didn't fish and didn't cook fish, and word had traveled the way it always did in small communities. Frank Hollister was a patient man, a fair man, but he was also a man who took his job seriously. He stood in Eleanor's barn, looking at the eagle in her nest of straw, and his face told her everything she needed to know about the trouble she was in. Federal law, he explained. Protected species. She could face fines, prosecution, seizure of the bird. Eleanor listened to all of it with her hands folded calmly in front of her. When he finished, she looked him in the eye and said 4 words that would become family legend. Then arrest me after. Frank Hollister did not arrest her. He stood in that barn for a long moment, looking at the eagle, looking at Eleanor, calculating something in his mind that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the kind of judgment that matters more than statutes. Finally, he sighed. He told her what he knew about caring for raptors, which was not much. He told her to keep the bird warm, try to get fluids into her, and pray. He said he would not be back unless someone made him come back. At the door, he paused and said one more thing. You know she'll probably die anyway. Eleanor nodded. She knew, but probably was not certainly, and that was enough. The days blurred into weeks. Eleanor learned to handle raw fish without flinching, to cut it into strips small enough for a weakened eagle to swallow. She learned to drip water into the corner of a beak without drowning the bird. She learned the particular quality of silence that meant the eagle was sleeping, and the slight shift in breathing that meant she was awake and watching. There were setbacks, days when the eagle refused food, nights when her breathing turned ragged and shallow, mornings when Eleanor walked to the barn certain she would find a body instead of a patient. But there were victories too, small ones at first. A strip of fish accepted, a head lifted without trembling, a wing extended and folded back with something approaching strength. On the 14th day, the eagle stood. It happened without warning. Eleanor entered the barn with the morning's fish, and instead of the prone form she had grown accustomed to, she found the eagle upright on the straw, wings slightly spread for balance, amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stopped Eleanor in her tracks. They regarded each other across the length of the barn. 2 creatures who had no business being in each other's lives, connected now by something neither could name. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks, and she did not wipe them away. She simply stood there, holding the fish, and let herself feel the magnitude of what was happening. The eagle was going to live. The weeks became months. Winter came to the Montana Valley with its customary ferocity, and Eleanor moved the eagle into a larger enclosure she built herself from old fencing and lumber scraps. The bird's strength returned steadily. She began to eat with appetite, to flap her wings in the confined space, to emit sharp calls that echoed off the barn walls. Eleanor had expected the eagle to grow wilder as she healed, to become the fierce predator she was meant to be. Instead, something else happened. A trust developed between them that Eleanor had never experienced with any animal. The eagle would allow Eleanor to approach without mantling her wings in threat. She would accept food directly from Eleanor's hand, her beak closing gently around the fish, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. She would make soft sounds when Eleanor spoke to her, not the fierce screams of a hunting eagle, but quiet chirps and clucks that seemed almost like conversation. Frank Hollister stopped by once in January, trudging through 2 feet of snow to check on the situation. He found Eleanor sitting in the enclosure, reading aloud from a book of poetry, while the eagle preened on a makeshift perch 3 feet away. He watched for a long moment, then left without saying anything. Some things did not require words. Spring arrived late that year, as it often did in Montana. The snow retreated slowly up the mountainsides, revealing meadows of brown grass that would soon turn green. The creek swelled with meltwater, and the air filled with the sounds of returning songbirds. Eleanor knew what spring meant. She had always known. The eagle was fully healed now, her wings strong enough to carry her anywhere, her instincts surely pulling her toward the sky and the wild life she had been born to live. Keeping her would be a cruelty wrapped in love, and Eleanor Webb was not a cruel woman. She chose the morning of March 23rd, an arbitrary date made significant only by the weather. The sky was clear, the winds were calm, and the sun rose over the eastern ridge with a warmth that promised the long winter was finally releasing its grip. Eleanor carried the eagle to the ridge in her arms, a journey that would have been unthinkable 4 months ago. This wild creature cradled against her chest like an old friend. They stood together at the highest point of the property, where the land dropped away to the valley below and the sky opened up in all directions. The eagle seemed to sense what was happening. Her head swiveled, taking in the expanse of air, the thermals already beginning to rise from the sun-warmed earth. Her talons flexed against Eleanor's arm with an agitation that was new and necessary. Eleanor did not give a speech. She did not say goodbye. She simply opened her arms and let the eagle step onto a fence post she had placed there for this purpose. For a long moment, nothing happened. The eagle perched on the post, looking at the sky, looking at Eleanor, as if making a decision. Then she spread her wings, that massive wingspan nearly 7 feet from tip to tip, and Eleanor gasped at the beauty of it. With a push of powerful legs and a single downstroke, the eagle was airborne. She rose on the morning thermals, circling higher and higher, her silhouette shrinking against the brightening sky. Eleanor watched until her eyes burned, until the eagle was nothing but a distant speck, until even that speck vanished into the blue. Then she walked back to the farmhouse alone, and the barn felt emptier than it ever had. 3 days passed. Eleanor moved through them like a sleepwalker, performing the rituals of daily life without feeling them. She had known this would hurt. She had not known it would hurt like this. A physical ache in her chest, a constant turning of her head toward windows, a listening for sounds that did not come. On the morning of the 4th day, she walked to the ridge out of habit, not hope. The fence post stood where she had placed it, weathered wood against the bright sky, empty. Eleanor turned to leave. A shadow passed over her. She looked up and her heart stopped. The eagle circled twice, 3 times, then descended with a precision that spoke of decision rather than accident. She landed on the fence post, the same fence post, and turned to face Eleanor with those amber eyes. Eleanor stood motionless, afraid that any movement might break the spell. The eagle showed no fear, no hesitation. She settled onto the post as if she had never left, as if this spot belonged to her and always had. Eleanor began to cry, not gentle tears this time, but deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere below language. The eagle watched her without flinching, and when Eleanor finally gathered herself enough to speak, she said the only thing that mattered. "You came back." The eagle ruffled her feathers, tucked her head beneath her wing, and slept. This became the pattern of Eleanor's remaining years. The eagle did not stay. She was wild, and the wild called her to hunt and soar and live as her kind was meant to live. But she returned. Every few days at first, then weekly, then with a regularity that seemed almost scheduled. She would appear at the fence post at dawn, spend an hour or 2 in Eleanor's company, then lift off toward whatever distant territory she had claimed. Sometimes she brought gifts, a rabbit carcass, a fish, and left them on the post like offerings. Sometimes she simply sat and watched Eleanor move through her morning chores, a silent witness to the ordinary rituals of human life. Word spread, as word always does in small places. People began to make the drive out to the Webb homestead, hoping to catch a glimpse of the widow and her eagle. Eleanor tolerated them with the patience of a woman who had outlived most of her contemporaries. She would answer their questions, share her story, accept their wonder as a kind of tribute, not to herself, but to the miracle of connection that had entered her life. The eagle ignored these visitors entirely. She had no interest in people who were not Eleanor. In 1971, Eleanor's granddaughter Judith brought her young son David to the homestead for a summer visit. David was 8 years old, curious and observant, in the way of children who spend too much time with books and not enough time with other children. Eleanor took to him immediately. She saw something in him that reminded her of Harold, a quietness, a capacity for patience, a willingness to sit and watch without needing to act. She decided to show him the eagle. They walked to the ridge at dawn, Eleanor moving slowly now with the weight of 76 years, David matching his pace to hers without being asked. The fence post was empty when they arrived, and Eleanor felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. The eagle had been coming for 8 years now, regular as seasons, but there was never any guarantee. She had always known that one morning the sky would stay empty, and she had learned to hold each visit as a gift rather than an expectation. They waited. David sat on a rock, his thin legs drawn up beneath him, his eyes scanning the sky with an intensity that made Eleanor smile. He did not ask questions. He did not fidget. He simply watched, as if he understood that some things could not be summoned, only received. The eagle appeared from the east, riding the first thermals of the morning. She was larger now, fully mature, her white head and tail blazing in the early light. She circled the ridge twice, and Eleanor felt the familiar catch in her chest, the same astonishment she had felt on that first morning 9 years ago. Then, the eagle's pattern changed. Instead of landing directly on the post, she made a lower pass, her shadow sweeping across the rock where David sat. The boy looked up, his face transformed by wonder, and the eagle turned her head to look back at him as she passed. Eleanor watched this exchange with tears in her eyes. The eagle landed on the post, settled her feathers, and fixed her gaze on the child with the same directness she had once shown Eleanor in a drift of autumn leaves. David turned to his grandmother, and Eleanor saw that he was crying too, though he did not seem to know it. 3 generations of Webbs now, witnessed and remembered by a creature who should not have been capable of remembering anything. The eagle nested the following spring. Eleanor found the nest in a massive pine on the north edge of the property, a construction of sticks and branches that must have weighed several hundred pounds. She visited it daily, keeping a respectful distance, watching through Harold's old binoculars as the eagle and a mate, a male who had appeared that winter, took turns incubating eggs that Eleanor would never see hatch but knew were there. 2 chicks fledged in early summer. Eleanor watched them make their first clumsy flights, watched the parents teach them to hunt, watched them grow strong enough to leave. By autumn, the young eagles had dispersed to find territories of their own, following instincts older than any human memory. But the original eagle, Eleanor's eagle, remained. She had made this land her home in a way that went beyond territorial instinct, and she returned to the fence post through all the seasons that followed. Eleanor's health declined in the way that health declines for those who have lived long and hard. Her joints stiffened, her vision blurred, her walks grew shorter and slower. But she never stopped making the morning pilgrimage to the ridge, even when it took her an hour to travel a distance she had once covered in minutes. The eagle always waited, as if she understood that patience was now part of the covenant between them. On the morning of April the 7th, 1974, Eleanor Webb did not wake up. She had gone to sleep the night before in the bedroom she had shared with Harold, in the house they had built together 50 years earlier, and somewhere in the small hours, her heart had simply stopped beating. She was 79 years old. Judith found her that afternoon, peaceful in her bed, her hands folded as if in prayer. The funeral was held 3 days later at the small cemetery outside town, where Webbs had been buried for 4 generations. The morning was cold and overcast, the sky threatening rain that never quite fell. Family and neighbors gathered around the grave, speaking the words that people speak when they have lost someone who mattered. No one noticed the eagle at first. She arrived without sound, appearing from the grey sky like a spirit summoned by grief. She circled the cemetery once, twice, 3 times, her massive wings catching updrafts that should not have existed on such a still day. Then she climbed higher, spiraling upward until she was just a dark shape against the clouds, and released a cry that echoed across the valley, a sound that those present would remember for the rest of their lives. Judith raised her camera, hands shaking, and captured the image. An eagle soaring above a fresh grave, wings spread against the Montana sky, mourning in the only way an eagle could mourn. It became the first documented evidence of what the Webb family had always known. The photograph would eventually hang in Marcus's office, a grainy testament to a bond that transcended everything science claimed to understand. 2 years after Eleanor's death, the eagle returned. Not to an empty ridge, the fence post still stood where Eleanor had placed it, but to a property now owned by David Webb, the quiet boy who had sat on a rock and been witnessed. David had moved his young family to Montana, taking over the homestead that had passed through 3 generations of his family. He had not expected the eagle to come. Eleanor's journals, which he had inherited along with the land, made it clear that the bond had been between her and the bird, something personal and unrepeatable. But on a March morning, almost exactly 13 years after Eleanor had released her healed eagle from that ridge, David looked up from his coffee to see a dark shape circling above the property. He walked to the ridge, his heart pounding with something between hope and fear. The eagle landed on the fence post, the same fence post, rebuilt now but occupying the same ground, and regarded him with amber eyes that seemed to hold recognition. She was old for an eagle, perhaps 15 years, but still powerful, still wild, still carrying herself with the dignity of a creature who answered to no one. David stood very still, remembering that summer morning when he was 8 years old, remembering the shadow passing over him, remembering the way his grandmother had wept with joy. The eagle watched him for several minutes, then lifted off and soared toward the eastern mountains. She returned 3 days later, and 3 days after that, and soon a pattern had established itself that David recognized from Eleanor's journals. Regular visits, silent communion, a covenant renewed across generations and species. David's son, Marcus, was born in 1990, the same year the bald eagle was removed from the endangered species list. The recovery of the species, from fewer than 500 breeding pairs to nearly 10,000, was celebrated as one of the great conservation successes of the 20th century. But for the Webb family, the eagles had never been about species or statistics. They had been about one bird, one woman, and the impossible bond that had formed between them on an October morning in 1962. The original eagle died sometime in the late 1980s. David found no body, but the bird simply stopped appearing, and he understood that she had gone to wherever eagles go when their time is finished. He mourned her with a grief that surprised him, a grief that felt inherited, passed down from Eleanor through channels that had nothing to do with blood. But the following spring, another eagle came. Younger, smaller, with markings that David would later learn were consistent with a direct descendant of the original bird. She landed on the fence post, regarded David with the same direct stare he had come to know, and the covenant continued. Marcus grew up with the eagles the way other children grew up with family pets. Every spring, he and his father would walk to the ridge at dawn to wait for the annual return. Every spring, an eagle would appear, sometimes the same bird as the previous year, sometimes a new one with subtle variations in plumage that suggested a generational shift. David kept careful records, continuing the tradition Eleanor had begun. Dates, behaviors, distinguishing marks. He taught Marcus to do the same, instilling in his son the discipline of observation that would eventually lead to a career in wildlife biology. The eagles became Marcus's North Star, the fixed point around which his life organized itself. While other children dreamed of astronauts or athletes, Marcus dreamed of understanding how a wild creature could remember a family across decades. He devoured every book he could find on eagle behavior, on animal cognition, on the science of memory and recognition. He learned that eagles were intelligent, that they could recognize individual humans, that they formed strong pair bonds that lasted for life. But nothing he read explained what happened on his family's property. Nothing he read accounted for the way successive generations of eagles returned to the same fence post, the same ridge, the same family, as if guided by a map written not in geography, but in relationship. His father told him once, on a dawn walk when Marcus was 14, "They remember us, son. Science says they shouldn't, but they do." Marcus had nodded, accepting this as he had accepted everything about the eagles, with faith rather than proof, with love rather than logic. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a question had taken root. A question that would drive him through college and graduate school, through years of field research and rejected papers and professional skepticism. The question was simple. What if he could prove it? Marcus earned his doctorate from the University of Montana in 2015, specializing in raptor ecology and behavior. His dissertation committee had been skeptical of his proposed research, a longitudinal study of eagle fidelity to specific human families, but they had allowed him to proceed, partly because his preliminary data was intriguing and partly because his passion was impossible to deny. He spent 4 years collecting evidence, DNA samples from shed feathers on the family property, GPS tracking data from eagles tagged by state wildlife agencies, detailed behavioral observations recorded across dozens of visits. The results exceeded even his own expectations. The eagles returning to the Webb property were genetically related, a single bloodline stretching back at least 5 generations, possibly 6. They shared distinctive markers that distinguished them from other eagle populations in the region, and their migratory patterns were anomalous. They traveled over 2,000 miles each year, yet they returned to this specific property with a precision that defied statistical probability. Marcus presented his findings at a wildlife conference in Missoula and was met with polite skepticism. Interesting, his colleagues said, suggestive, but coincidence could explain most of it. Territorial imprinting could account for the rest. No one wanted to accept the implication of Marcus's data, that these eagles were returning not just to a place, but to a people, that they were maintaining a relationship across generations in a way that no scientific model could accommodate. Marcus understood their resistance. He had felt it himself, the pull of rationality against the gravity of faith. But he also had something his colleagues lacked: 60 years of family history, documented in Eleanor's journals and David's records and his own meticulous observations. He had a photograph of an eagle circling his great-grandmother's funeral. He had the memory of a childhood spent walking to the ridge with his father, waiting for a visitor who always came. He had proof, even if he didn't yet have explanation. The spring of 2023 brought a crisis that Marcus had never anticipated. A development company based in Denver had identified the Webb property as an ideal location for a luxury resort. The valley's natural beauty, the proximity to national forest land, the relative accessibility from major population centers, all of it made the homestead valuable in ways that had nothing to do with eagles or covenants or family history. They offered David Webb $4 million for the property, an amount that would transform the lives of everyone in the family. The offer arrived in March, just as the first eagles of the season were beginning to appear on their northern migration. Marcus was in the field when he got the call from his father, working on a population study in Yellowstone. He drove back to Montana that same night, 7 hours through darkness and snow, his mind churning with a fear he couldn't quite name. The family meeting was held on a Saturday in the living room of the house Eleanor and Harold had built. David was there, 79 years old now, moving carefully with the deliberation of age. Marcus's mother, Patricia, who had never quite understood the eagles, but had learned to respect what they meant to her husband. His Aunt Margaret, David's sister, who had grown up in the valley, but moved away decades ago and now saw the property primarily as an asset. His cousins, their spouses, a constellation of relatives with varying degrees of connection to the land and its history. The discussion was painful. Margaret argued for the sale. The money would secure their retirements, fund their grandchildren's education, provide a cushion against the uncertainties of the future. Her children agreed. The property was beautiful, yes, and the eagle story was lovely, but nostalgia was not a financial plan. They could use the money to do real good in the world, to help real people with real problems. Marcus listened to these arguments, felt their weight, understood their logic. $4 million was not nothing. It could transform lives, create opportunities, solve problems that his family had carried for years. He looked at his father's face and saw the struggle there, the pull of practical wisdom against the gravity of everything he had witnessed on that ridge. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus did not talk about money. He talked about Eleanor. He talked about an October morning in 1962, a widow finding a dying eagle in a drift of autumn leaves. He talked about the choice she made, the coat she wrapped around a wild creature, the months of patient care that followed. He talked about the release, the return, the 60 years of visits that had followed. He talked about the photograph at the funeral, the way the eagle had circled and cried as if mourning a friend. He talked about what it had meant to grow up on this land, to wait at the ridge with his father, to understand from childhood that some bonds transcended every category humans tried to impose on the world. When he finished, the room was silent. Margaret looked away, uncomfortable. The cousins shifted in their seats, but David Webb was smiling, a small smile that Marcus recognized from every dawn they had shared on that ridge, the smile of a man who knew something beyond words. The decision was not made that day or the next. It took 2 weeks of discussion, argument, and ultimately, transformation. Margaret's resistance softened after David showed her Eleanor's journals, page after page of careful observation, of hope and heartbreak and joy, written in the hand of a woman Margaret barely remembered, but suddenly felt she knew. The cousins came around more slowly, persuaded not by emotion, but by Marcus's scientific data, by the recognition that what happened on this property was genuinely unique, genuinely worthy of protection. The final vote was held on a Friday evening in April. By then, the spring eagles had returned, a mated pair, 6th generation of the bloodline Eleanor had saved. Marcus had watched them arrive 3 days earlier, had stood on the ridge as they circled and called and finally settled onto the fence posts that still marked the spot where everything had begun. He had told them, speaking aloud as Eleanor once had, that he was fighting for them, that he would do everything in his power to ensure this place remained their home. The vote was unanimous. Even Margaret, in the end, could not bring herself to break the covenant. They would establish a conservation easement on the property, protecting it from development in perpetuity, while allowing the family to retain ownership and residence. The land would remain wild, the eagles would keep coming, and 60 years of documented miracle would continue into a future that none of them would live to see. The signing ceremony took place at dawn on the ridge, because Marcus could imagine no other fitting location. The family gathered in the early light, lawyers and paperwork seeming absurd against the backdrop of mountains and sky. David Webb's signature was first, a trembling hand that had grown too weak to walk to this spot without help but still remembered how to write his name. Then Marcus, then the others, each adding their mark to a document that translated faith into law. As the final signature was completed, Margaret's, as it happened, the last holdout become the last to commit. A shadow passed over the assembled group. 2 eagles descended from the morning sky, riding the thermals with the precision of creatures who had been doing this for millennia. They landed on the fence posts side by side, male and female, and turned their white heads to regard the humans gathered below. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face and did not bother to wipe them away. His father reached for his hand and gripped it with surprising strength. The eagles watched them, watched all of them, with an attention that felt like witness, like acknowledgement, like the closing of a circle that had been drawn 60 years before. They stayed for nearly an hour, longer than any visit Marcus had documented, preening and calling softly to each other, and occasionally fixing that amber gaze on one human or another, as if memorizing faces. When they finally lifted off, rising together into the brightening sky, Marcus understood something he had always known but never quite articulated. These birds were not returning to land. They were returning to people, to his great-grandmother, to his father, to him, to the choice Eleanor had made on an October morning, when she could have walked away, but didn't. The eagles remembered kindness the way water remembers the shape of stone, not through consciousness, but through something deeper, something written into the fabric of what they were. The morning after the signing, Marcus walked to the ridge alone. He carried Eleanor's journal in his hands, the original volume bound in cracked leather, filled with her careful handwriting and amateur sketches of eagle anatomy. He sat on the rock where David had once sat as a child, and he read her words as the sun climbed above the eastern mountains. She had written about so many things: the daily progress of the eagle's recovery, her conversations with the bird, her growing certainty that something miraculous was happening. But one passage stood out, written on the day before the eagle's release, when Eleanor had sat in the barn for hours watching her patient sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring either reunion or permanent farewell. "She knows me," Eleanor had written. "I cannot explain it and I will not try. She knows me the way Harold knew me, the way my children know me, not through words but through something underneath words. When I look into her eyes, I see recognition. I see trust. I see, God help me, something very like love. I do not know what tomorrow will bring. I do not know if I will ever see her again after I open my arms and let her fly. But I know this: whatever happens, this winter has saved me. I thought I was rescuing her, but she was rescuing me all along. We have given each other something that neither of us had before. I think we have given each other a reason to believe." Marcus closed the journal and looked up at the sky. No eagles yet. It was early, and they were territorial creatures with routines of their own. But he knew they would come. Today or tomorrow, this spring or the next, for as long as this family kept faith with this land. He thought about Eleanor, about the courage it had taken for a 67-year-old widow to wrap a dying predator in her coat and carry it home. He thought about his father, inheriting a covenant he had never asked for, and carrying it faithfully for 50 years. He thought about his own life, shaped entirely by a bond formed before he was born. dedicated to understanding something that might always exceed understanding. And he thought about the future, about children not yet born who would walk to this ridge someday, who would wait for the eagles to return, who would stand in the lineage of Webbs, who had chosen again and again to honor something larger than themselves. The summer brought unexpected news. Marcus's wife Jennifer was pregnant with their first child. They had been trying for years, had almost given up hope, and now here was life announcing itself in the most ordinary and miraculous way possible. Marcus received the news on the ridge, where he had gone to document a mid-season visit from the female eagle. Jennifer had driven out from town, unable to wait, and had walked the familiar path to find him standing at his usual post with his binoculars raised to the sky. The eagle was still there when Jennifer reached him, perched on the fence post, watching with her usual direct attention. Marcus would always remember the moment, his wife's face as she told him, the eagle's presence behind her, the sense that all the threads of his life were suddenly weaving together into something he could not yet see, but could feel taking shape. They decided that day to name their daughter Eleanor, after the woman who had started everything. It seemed right, seemed necessary, seemed like the only possible choice. The name would carry forward a legacy that had nothing to do with property or wealth, and everything to do with the courage to choose love when the world offered easier options. Eleanor Webb, the younger, was born in February of the following year, during a snowstorm that closed roads and knocked out power across the valley. Marcus delivered her himself, in the same bedroom where his great-great-grandmother had labored, guided by a midwife over a crackling satellite phone. The birth was difficult but uncomplicated, and by morning the storm had passed and the sun had returned, and a new Webb was breathing the Montana air for the first time. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's thoughtful eyes, and when she cried, her voice carried the kind of determination that Marcus recognized immediately. This one would walk to the ridge. This one would wait for the eagles. This one would carry the covenant forward into whatever future awaited. The eagles returned early that spring, arriving in March when the snow still lay heavy on the ground. Marcus had been watching for them, checking the sky each morning with an anticipation that had not dimmed in 30 years. When he spotted the first dark shape riding the thermals above the eastern ridge, he gathered his daughter from her crib. She was 3 weeks old, wrapped in blankets, her eyes barely focusing on the world around her, and carried her to the place where everything had begun. The walk was slow, careful, Marcus holding his daughter the way Eleanor must have held the wounded eagle all those years ago, with tenderness and fear and overwhelming hope. He reached the ridge as the sun broke above the mountains, and the eagle was already there, waiting on her fence post as if she had known he was coming. Marcus stood very still. His daughter made a small sound, something between a cry and a coo, and the eagle's head turned toward them. For a long moment, nothing moved. The eagle studied the bundle in Marcus's arms with that piercing amber attention, her gaze moving from the infant to Marcus and back again as if making a connection, drawing a conclusion, adding another face to the catalogue of webs she carried in whatever passed for memory in an eagle's mind. Then she settled deeper into her perch, ruffled her feathers against the morning cold, and turned her face toward the rising sun. Marcus felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't known he was carrying. The eagle had seen his daughter. The eagle would remember. The covenant that Eleanor Webb had begun 63 years ago, in an act of impossible compassion, would continue for at least one more generation. He stood on the ridge until his arms ached from holding his daughter, until the eagle finally lifted off and soared toward the hunting grounds, until there was nothing left to do but walk back to the farmhouse and begin the ordinary work of raising a child. But ordinary had a different meaning now. Ordinary meant dawn walks to the ridge and patient waiting. Ordinary meant teaching a daughter to look up, to watch, to trust that some bonds could outlast understanding. Ordinary meant being part of something that had started before you were born and would continue after you were gone. A covenant written not in words, but in the space between species, where kindness became memory and memory became legacy. Years from now, Marcus knows, he will be gone and his daughter will be standing where he stands now, watching for eagles that are the 8th or 9th generation of a bloodline saved by a lonely widow on an October morning in 1962. The fence post will be different, rebuilt again probably as the wood weathers and fails, but the spot will be the same. The mountains will be the same. The light will be the same. And an eagle will circle down from the brightening sky and land with the certainty of a creature who knows exactly where she belongs. His daughter will feel what he has felt, what his father felt, what Eleanor felt on the day her eagle returned. The staggering, humbling, joyful weight of being remembered by something wild. She will understand that this is not about possession or control, but about witness, about being present for something larger than individual lives. She will know, as every Webb has known since 1962, that love can transcend the categories we create for it, that it can bridge species and span decades and write itself into the very blood of those who receive it. This is the inheritance Marcus will leave his daughter. Not property, not money, but the knowledge of what it means to be trusted by the wild. He will give her Eleanor's journals and David's records and his own years of research. He will give her mornings on the ridge and the patience to wait and the faith to believe that some promises are kept across generations. He will give her a story that begins with a dying eagle in a drift of autumn leaves and has no ending, only continuation. Only the perpetual return of creatures who remember what their ancestors were given and come back, year after year, to honor a debt that was never owed and can never be repaid. The eagle turns her head toward Marcus now, in this present moment, on this spring morning in Montana. She holds his gaze with the same directness that Eleanor described in her journals 60 years ago, the same knowing attention that has passed through 6 generations of her kind. Marcus does not speak. There is nothing to say that hasn't been said, nothing to add to the conversation that has been ongoing since before he was born. He simply stands in the presence of something miraculous and lets himself feel the full weight of it. The grief of Eleanor's loneliness transformed into the joy of connection. The wounded eagle healed not just in body, but in some deeper place where wildness and trust coexist. The generations of Webbs who have walked to this ridge and waited and been rewarded with the impossible gift of recognition. He whispers his great-grandmother's name into the cold morning air, Eleanor, and the eagle shifts on her perch, settles deeper into her position, and does not fly away.